Hello everybody, great to be learning with you on a Sunday. Heading into last days of Pesach begins tonight. 7th and 8th day of Pesach, of Passover, are full-fledged holidays like the first 2 days. That's why I have a special class at a special time right now. And we will not have class tomorrow night, Monday, nor Tuesday. And then we'll resume our regular schedule on Wednesday. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Maybe not everybody got the memo about the special holiday schedule. But Bill in mid-Missouri, Bella in Florida, Joe in the Inland Empire, Ryan in Jacksonville, Ella's in the house, Franco in Trieste, Italy. Welcome everybody, and hopefully everyone else will find it. Our daf today is Nun Vav, page 56, here in Tractate Bava Metzia, the 22nd volume of the Talmud. We are continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 6 in chapter 4. Hold on a second. Chapter 4. And then with God's help, we will conclude our discussion of Mishnah number 6 and open Mishnah number 7. Today's daf is quite short. Okay, here we go. Rav Yosef said, although Rabbi Meir is lenient with regard to redemption of second tithe demai, he is stringent with regard to its consumption. So at the end of yesterday, we were saying, wait a minute, is Rabbi Meir stricter, more stringent than all the other sages? Or is he more lenient? Not surprisingly, depends on the question at hand, depends on the issue that we are discussing. So with this second tithe demai, so Meiser Sheni, the second tithe out of the produce that people use in 4 out of the 7 years of the Shemitah cycle to fund their food and drink when they go to Jerusalem for a festival like Passover that we're in now, as it was done when the Holy Temple was standing in Jerusalem. And demai, that is produce that you have reason to doubt whether it was tithed or not. And so by rabbinic decree, it's going to need to be tithed again. Now, if you're redeeming something that was set aside as second tithe, and if you redeem your own, you have to add a fifth. What if there's a possibility that it was tithed? It's not for sure untithed. There's a good possibility that it was tithed. You just can't be sure. So if you're going to go to the extra trouble of possibly redeeming it twice because you're accepting the stringency on yourself to tithe or to redeem demai, do you also have to add the fifth as you would when you're normally redeeming Meiser Sheni? It seems that Rabbi Meir would say yes, right? And the question was asked, does Rabbi Meir elevate these laws that are by rabbinic decree up to the same level of stringency and enforcement as written Torah laws? Now, he's not saying that rabbinic decrees, have the same force that laws written by God do. The question that they're asking is, but do the sages treat them with the same stringency because they lack the force that written laws in the Torah have? In other words, laws that are by rabbinic decree are for our protection. It's a fence around the Torah to protect us from coming to violate written Torah laws. But once we're talking about a rabbinic decree, are we going to add like a penalty, like adding the fifth to its enforcement? And the Rabbi Meir, in the places where he is stringent in this regard, would say, yeah, because people need to take rabbinic decrees as seriously as Torah laws, and if we don't back them up, right, with these kinds of penalties, with this kind of enforcement mechanism, the people might come to ignore them. Whereas the rabbis would say, no, our general principle is when there's a doubt with respect to Torah law, we're stringent. When there's a doubt with respect to rabbinic decree, we are lenient. So that's the kind of context of this discussion. So Rav Yosef said, although Rabbi Meir is lenient with regard to redemption of second tithe demai, he is stringent with regard to whether he can consume it, right? Where the owner can consume it, because you can only consume second tithe either when you take it up to Jerusalem during the festival and eat it in Jerusalem, or after you've transferred its sanctity to money. The money's going to go up to Jerusalem to fund your pilgrimage, right, during the festival. But then the second tithe that was redeemed, that means it was deconsecrated, and now you can eat it. Well, what if you paid the principal to redeem that second tithe, but you didn't add the fifth? Can you consume it or not? That's how we got to this discussion. So this is as it is taught in a baraisa. The sages permitted only a wholesaler to sell demai, doubtfully tithed produce. What does this mean? Since a wholesaler acquires grain from numerous sources and sells large quantities, he would suffer significant loss if he were required to separate tithes each time. But in the case of a proprietor who purchased produce from an Am Haaretz, so you buy it from a Jew who you have reason to suspect he's not observant enough that he would be meticulous in tithing the food, right? You have reason to, you can't be sure that this guy, was a Torah observant Jew enough that when you're buying produce from him that you can be confident that he tithed it. Since you can't be confident, this is demai, this is doubtfully tithed produce, and by rabbinic decree, you have to tithe it, even though it might end up that food was tithed twice because the Am Haaretz did in fact. Whoa, what's going on? Hold on. Are we? Okay, I think we're streaming again. Just double checking. Yeah, we are streaming. Okay. So that you might have to, you might have to tithe it again. That's the price we pay if we're buying from an Am Haaretz. Now, obviously, you could just ask him, did you tithe it? Right? Now, if you have no reason to suspect that he would lie to you, just simply that he didn't know the law, once he tells you that he tithed it, well, then it's not demai. But it can often happen that you buy this produce and then sell it to someone else, and there was not this opportunity to ask the Am Haaretz that it came from whether he tithed it or not, right? And so the Chaverim, meaning those people who were meticulous in their observance of the mitzvah, so kind of going above and beyond, they would never buy from an Am Haaretz. If they did, they would assume it was demai, they would tithe it themselves, etc. Okay, so about this. Where am I? Right? So the rabbis say, both a wholesaler and a proprietor who sells in bulk may sell demai. Well, hold on, let me go back. This is as it is taught in baraisa. The sages permitted only a wholesaler to sell demai. Since a wholesaler acquires from numerous sources and sells large quantities, we can't expect him to enforce these laws of tithing and possibly retithing demai. But in the case of a proprietor who purchased produce from an Am Haaretz, whether he purchased large quantities to sell in bulk or whether he purchased small quantities to sell by little by little, he must tithe the produce. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir, right? So stringent view, whatever amounts you're selling in, if you're not a wholesaler, if it's demai, now you have to take the tithe before you sell it. The baraisa continues, and the rabbis say, meaning the majority who overrule Rabbi Meir, and the rabbis say both a wholesaler and a proprietor who sells in bulk may sell demai or send it to another or give it to him as a gift, and they need not be concerned. and the one who receives the produce separates the tithes and consumes the remaining produce. So in this baraisa, Rabbi Meir was stringent with regard to the concern that someone will consume demai without tithes being separated. So Ravina raises an objection from a Mishna, demai 5.3. One who purchases bread from a baker who is unreliable, right? So he's an am haaretz. We can't be sure that he separated challah, right? The portion set aside for the priest, which would render the rest of the bread consumable by Jews. Right? So one who purchases bread from a baker who is unreliable with regard to tithes, okay, not with regard to challah, but with regard to tithes, that makes him an am haaretz. This person who purchases from that baker may tithe from warm bread, meaning to exempt, cold bread, and from cold bread for warm bread, and one may do so even if the bread is in different shapes from many molds. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. So here you're seeing how the problem sort of is perpetuated down the chain. If an am haaretz harvested this grain, right, and he may not have tithed it at that point, and then a baker bought the grain, and he didn't tithe it before he baked it, and now you're buying from a baker, right, who might not have tithed it, and he bought it from a farmer who might not have tithed it. So then you're going to tithe it at the bread stage, right? You're going to separate these tithes at the bread stage. And what Rabbi Meir is saying, although you have to tithe it, you can't separate from warm bread for cold or from cold bread from warm. They don't have to be in the same category. Now, why is this relevant? Granted, one may tithe from cold bread for warm bread in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Eli. As Rabbi Eli says, from where is it derived with regard to one who separates teruma from poor quality produce for superior quality produce, that his teruma is teruma? Right, ab initio, you should separate the finest of your produce to give that first 2% as teruma to a priest. But if you didn't, if you took from your inferior quality produce, nevertheless, you satisfied your obligation. How do we know this? It is as it is stated, and you shall bear no sin by reason of it, seeing that you have set apart from it the best thereof. Numbers 18:32. The Torah warns the Levites not to separate teruma from their tithe, which now it's the tithe of teruma, which they give to priests. The Torah warns the Levites not to separate teruma from low quality produce. So the question arises, if when one separates lower quality produce, that produce is not sacred, why would one think that he bears sin? He did nothing. So from here it is derived that although the Levite acted improperly, in the case of one who separates teruma from poor quality produce in order to exempt, in order to satisfy the obligation to tithe for superior quality produce, he should have done it this way, but nonetheless, his teruma is teruma. So rather, with regard to the law that one may tithe even if the bread is in different shapes from many different molds, let Rabbi Meir be concerned lest the buyer come to tithe from the loaves that one is obligated to tithe for the loaves that one is exempt from tithing, or from the exempt for the obligated. Since these loaves are all demai, it is possible that the loaves shaped in one mold were baked from produce that had been tithed, and the loaves shaped in another mold were baked from produce that had not been tithed. So apparently Rabbi Meir rules leniently in cases of rabbinic law. This is a long-winded way to say, how can you say that Rabbi Meir is so stringent? In this example of the baker's bread, who's an am haaretz, he seems to be lenient. So the Gemara returns to discuss the difficulties raised above. Abaye said the problem raised by Rabbi Elazar was legitimately difficult for him, and Shmuel did not legitimately respond to his difficulty by stating that the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir. This whole digression this whole line of reasoning that we've been on was actually not responsive to the original difficulty that Rabbi Elazar raised. And the reason that Shmuel's response was insufficient is that it was in the case, it was the case in the Mishnah of teruma of the tithe, right? So what a Levite, once he receives a tithe, then he has to separate teruma from that to give to a priest. And this is punishable with death at the hand of heaven, right? If he is lax and doesn't separate this teruma for the priest from the tithe that he received from the regular, the rest of the nation of Israel, that's punishable by kares. So that was difficult for Rabbi Elazar, who was questioning whether the sages reinforced their pronouncements concerning such a prohibition and rendered them parallel to Torah law. And Shmuel responded to him by citing Rabbi Meir's opinion concerning a get, a bill of divorce, right, where Rabbi Meir said that if an agent brought a get from overseas from a husband who's divorcing his wife, and he brings this get, and the agent hands it to her, but he fails to recite the rabbinic sage, the formula imposed on him by the sages to say, this was written in my presence and signed in my presence, he gives it to her without saying that statement, which the sages obligate him to say, then she thinks she's divorced and she goes and marries someone else, and then they have children. So according to Rabbi Meir, her divorce was not a divorce. The second husband has to now divorce her. And if they had children from that second marriage, those children are deemed mamzers. That was a very stringent view. Right, so the problem with Shmuel offering this very stringent view of Rabbi Meir to prove that he's stringent is that here Rabbi Meir was being stringent in a matter that, if it's violated intentionally, would result in the death penalty, right? Meaning, if a woman who is married, and is not divorced, goes and thinks she's marrying another man, or goes and marries another man, that's an illegitimate marriage. A married woman can't marry another man. So if she did this intentionally, right, then when she consummates that second non-union, that would be a death penalty offense. I mean, that's never going to be enforced. It's not a kind of death penalty that happens in real life. But we have to understand that would be a death penalty offense, right? If there were witnesses there that said to her, you're not divorced, you can't pretend to be married to the second man. If you sleep with that man, you're committing adultery, and the penalty for that is the death penalty. And then she immediately does that in front of the witnesses, then she would technically be liable to the death penalty. So the point is that it's a death penalty case where it's a death penalty in an earthly court. Whereas what Rabbi Elazar was talking about, that you could earn for yourself a death penalty at the hands of heaven, right? Which we don't even know exactly what that means. Perhaps that your life would be shortened, if you didn't make an atonement, etc. But it's a different kind of offense, right? So Shmuel offering Rabbi Meir's stringent view in the laws of adultery does not prove that Rabbi Meir would be so stringent in the laws of tithing, which are nowhere near as, don't incur the same kinds of penalties or legal procedures. Abaye continued, and Rav Sheish, and so perhaps the case involving court-imposed capital punishment is different, as it is more stringent, and Rabbi Meir renders rabbinic law parallel to Torah law only in such a case where he would, add these big harsh penalties, but maybe Rabbi Meir wouldn't be so stringent in the areas of tithing and demai. So Abaye continued, and Rav Sheshes does not legitimately raise an objection, as Rabbi Elazar and Shmuel are speaking about cases punishable by death, and Rav Sheshes raised his objection from a case involving a mere prohibition. As it is written with regard to second tithe, you may not eat within your gates the tithe of your grain or of your wine or of your oil. And to that which Rav Sheshes raised an objection, Rav Yosef legitimately responded to his difficulty. But as for Ravina, the question arises, rather than raising an objection from the case of a baker, from which proof is cited that Rabbi Meir does not draw a parallel between rabbinic law and Torah law, let him cite support for the assessment of the opinion of Rabbi Meir from the case of a bread merchant. As we learned in a Mishna in Tractate Demai 5.4, one who purchases bread from a merchant tithes separately from the bread of each and every mold. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. So in this case, Rabbi Meir is stringent with regard to Demai. So rather, what have you to say in explaining why Ravina did not cite a proof from this Mishnah that we just brought up? It is because a merchant purchases his supply from 2 or 3 people. Therefore, Rabbi Meir holds that one must be concerned that perhaps one of the suppliers separated tithes and another did not. So the customer must separate tithes from the bread of each and every mold. But if that is the case, Ravina should not cite a proof from the case of the baker as well, as the baker discussed in the Mishnah typically purchases his stock of grain from only one person. And therefore, in that case, there is no concern that perhaps the customer will tithe from the loaves that he is exempt from tithing for the loaves that he is obligated to tithe. And Rava said Shmuel responds well to that which was difficult to Rabbi Elazar, as the category of death in the world is one. Therefore, it is appropriate to cite proof from the case of court-imposed capital punishment to the case of death at the hand of heaven. At least we're talking about some kind of death penalty realm. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 6. Now, that was very technical, very difficult, sort of complex lines of reasoning to follow. If you had trouble with it, do not feel bad. But a good, before we move on to Mishnah 7, I think it's worth noting that, Talmudic learning is so good for the mind, right? Because the sages are so careful to say, are we comparing apples and apples, or are we comparing apples and oranges? Yes, we're comparing apples and apples. But are red apples and green apples always the same? What are the differences between red apples and green apples? Is it just color, or is it taste as well? If we're talking about a law that pertains to the color of these apples, are we going to apply it in questions that arise from their differences in taste? Maybe yes, maybe no. There's a limit to how far we'll extend a precedent, right? So they're really teaching us to sharpen our thinking as we're seeking to apply laws from one area to another, and within an area of law, from sort of one subdivision to another subdivision, and testing and challenging our logic. What gives us the right, or what gives the sages the right to apply a particular law or outcome or stringency or cause for doubt in one area before we extend it to another, right? So that's the basic that is a basic lesson that I think we should take with us. Okay, now Mishnah number 7 here in chapter 4. These are matters that are not subject to the laws of exploitation, right? Exploitation means a Jew in an area that is ruled, that is under Torah sovereignty, right? Where Torah law runs business transactions in that region. So one Jew cannot charge another Jew more than 1/6 above the market price, and if he does, the buyer has a claim against the seller that you exploited me. But of course, this does not include that if the seller, is passing on his costs, his cost of risk, cost of insurance, cost of transportation, etc., or if he's telling him, look, I bought it for this much, I'm selling it for this much, it is above the market value, do you want to buy it or not? There's many exceptions to the law. Now we're talking about different kinds of exceptions. Where, depending on the merchandise that is being bought and sold, these laws may or may not apply. So these are matters that are not subject to the laws of exploitation, even if the disparity between the value and the payment is 1/6 or greater. And these areas are slaves and documents and land and consecrated property. Obviously, thank God, slavery has been abolished in the world, but we're dealing of when these laws were given and where slavery was a very common practice, and the Torah came and gave the slaves rights that they had never had prior to the Torah coming into the world. But, the fact is, slaves were bought and sold, and so we have to examine what laws were in play when slaves were bought and sold. And as we've seen many times, the laws of buying and selling slaves were treated very similarly to land and not treated similarly to movable property. Documents are literally documents, and consecrated property, we've been talking about, if you consecrate property, well, that means what can you do with it? You can only give it to the temple. But the holy temple, for the upkeep of the temple, doesn't really want your cow or your donkey or your field. What it needs is the monetary worth of those things. So if you can't redeem your own property that you consecrated, you would sell it and then transfer the sanctity of that consecrated property onto the money, and then the money gets donated to the temple treasury. Now, in addition, if they are stolen, the following items are subject neither to payment of double the principal for theft, nor to payment of 4 or 5 times the principal if the thief slaughtered or sold a stolen sheep or cow, respectively. Okay, so meaning those same categories, slaves, documents, land, and consecrated property, if they are stolen, these items are subject neither to payment of double the principal for theft, nor to payment of 4 or 5 times the principal if the thief slaughtered or sold a stolen sheep or cow, respectively. And an unpaid bailee does not take an oath, and a paid bailee does not pay if these kinds of items are stolen or lost. Rabbi Shimon says, now on page 56b, with regard to sacrificial animals for which one bears responsibility to replace them, right? If you designate an animal that when the temple is standing, you're going to designate this particular sheep to bring it up as an offering, and it is stolen or lost, so you have to replace it and bring another equivalent sheep up as your offering, because you have to make good on the pledge you made to bring that animal as an offering. So with regard to sacrificial animals for which one bears responsibility to replace them, they are subject to the laws of exploitation. If you say, I'm going to bring a sheep as an offering, then if the sheep gets stolen or lost, you have to replace it with another sheep. If you say, I'm going to bring that sheep up as an offering, and it gets stolen or lost, I think you don't have to replace it, because the only thing you said was, I'm going to bring that sheep, right? So that's the difference. So with regard to sacrificial animals for which one bears responsibility to replace them, they are subject to the laws of exploitation, as this responsibility indicates a certain aspect of ownership. And for those for which one does not bear responsibility to replace them, like I said, that particular sheep, so then they are not subject to the laws of exploitation. And Rabbi Yehuda says, even in the case of one who sells a Torah scroll, an animal, or a pearl, these items are not subject to the laws of exploitation because they have no fixed price. And the rabbi said to him, the early sages stated that only these items listed above are not subject to the laws of exploitation. And so where did the law end up on this? All movable property is subject to the laws of exploitation, including Torah scrolls and precious stones, in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis in the Mishna who overruled Rabbi Yehuda. And that concludes Mishnah number 7. Here comes the Gemara. The Gemara asks, from where are these matters derived? It is, as the sages taught, it is written, Leviticus 25:14. And if you sell to your colleague an item that is sold or acquire from your colleague's hand, one shall not exploit his brother. So this is the basic law of exploitation, and this is referring to an item acquired from hand to hand, movable property. Land is excluded, as it is not movable. Slaves are excluded because they are juxtaposed to land in several sources in the Torah, and therefore their legal status is like that of land in certain aspects, in the sense that the way you inherit land is the way you would inherit slaves, and other laws like that. So documents are excluded, as it is written, and if you sell to your colleague an item that is sold, indicating an item that is itself sold and itself acquired. Documents are excluded as they are not sold themselves and they are not acquired themselves. They have no intrinsic value and they exist only for the proof therein, right? Documents only matter in terms of the content of the document that shows, for example, in a purchase and sale agreement, that some property that is possible to buy and sell has been bought or sold. But the documents themselves are only evidence of that. They're not objects in themselves that are bought and sold. So from here, the sages said, in the case of one who sells his documents that are no longer in use to a perfumer for use in packaging his wares, right? So let's say a lawyer has file cabinets full of contracts that are not useful anymore. All the people and the deals therein have been digitized. He doesn't need this mound of paper. So maybe he could get, $20 just selling the paper for pulp, or the paper for kindling. Or in the old times, they would use these paper as a perfumer would use it to wrap his vials of perfume. Okay, so then what? Doesn't it have value? Where am I? Right, so from here the sages said, in the case of one who sells his documents that are no longer in use to a perfumer for use in packaging his wares, they are subject to the laws of exploitation because he is selling the paper itself. And the Gemara asks, isn't this obvious? In that case, one sold paper, and it is no different from any other movable property. And the Gemara answers, well, this serves to exclude the opinion of Rav Kahana, who says there is no exploitation for cases involving perutot, right? Perutot, pennies, as paper is sold for mere perutot. And the sages therefore teach us there is exploitation for cases involving perutot. And consecrated property is excluded. As the verse states, one shall not exploit his brother, indicating that these laws apply only to transactions involving his brother, but not to transactions involving consecrated property. So that's a little bit unexpected and interesting. But these are laws that exist in purchase and sale between people and each other, not when you're talking about property of the Holy Temple, which is basically what consecrated property is. Rabba bar Memel objects to this. Is that to say that anywhere that it is written his hand, the reference is to his actual hand and not merely to his possession in the metaphorical sense? If that is so, that which is written and taken all his land from his hand in Numbers 21:26, would you also explain here that he was holding all his land in his hand? Land is not held in the hand. So rather, clearly, when you say taking something from his hand, you're saying it means from his possession, not necessarily from his physical hand. And here too, from your colleague's hand, in the case of exploitation, means from his possession. And if that is so, why are we not going to apply the laws of exploitation to purchase and sale of land? And the Gemara asks, is that to say that anywhere that it is written his hand, the reference is not to his actual hand? But isn't it taught in a baraisa if the theft is found in his hand? Exodus 22:3, and I've derived from this only his hand. From where do I derive that the halacha is the same if the stolen item is found on his roof, in his courtyard, or in his enclosure? And the verse states, if the theft is found, himatze timatze, and the use of that double verb teaches that the law applies in any case where the stolen item is in his possession, implying that if we didn't use that double verb, it would mean that it was only the law would only apply if it was literally found in his hand. The Gemara infers the halacha applies if the stolen item is found in his possession, and this includes any place in his possession. And the reason is that the merciful one writes, if the theft is found, hematze timatze. And if that double verb were not used, I would say that wherever he, the Lord, writes his hand, the reference is to his actual hand. And furthermore, it is taught in Baraisa that it is written with regard to a bill of divorce, a get, and place it in her hand. And I've derived only her hand. From where do I derive the law is the same if he places the bill of divorce on her roof, in her courtyard, or in her enclosure? And the verse states, and place. In any case, that he places it in her possession. So here too, the Gemara infers the reason that any place that is her possession is included as a viable place to deliver the get is because the merciful one added these extra words in the Torah, and place. But if those extra words were not there, I would say that wherever God writes, deliver from his hand or into his hand, the reference is to his actual hand. So rather, the Gemara rejects Rabbi Bar Memel's objection and concludes every mention of the term his hand in the Torah is a reference to his actual hand. And it is different there in the verse, and taken all his land from his hand, where it cannot be said that the reference is to his actual hand. Rather, it means there in his possession. When we're talking about land, it means in his possession because it can't be in his hand. But everywhere else, it does mean the type of property that could be held in his hand, i.e. movable property. Rabbi Zera raises a dilemma with regard to rentals. How much can you charge for your rental property? How much can you charge for your Airbnb? Is it subject to the laws of exploitation, or is it not subject to the laws of exploitation? And the Gemara explains, is it an item that is sold about which the merciful one speaks, but not a rental? Or perhaps there is no difference. And Abaye said to him, it is written, and if you sell an item that is sold forever, is that what sold means? Why can't items that are rented be included in the law of items that are sold? What is written is simply, and if you sell an item that is sold. And indeed, for its day, the rental is considered a sale. The legal status of a rental is that of a sale for a limited period. So consequently, it is subject to the laws of exploitation. Now that's interesting. We're talking about rented movable property. So what are we going to say about rented land? We don't know yet. Rava raises a dilemma in a case involving wheat kernels, and one sowed them in the ground, right? Planted them. What is the law? Are they subject to the laws of exploitation, or are they not subject to the laws of exploitation? The Gemara explains, is their legal status like that of kernels cast into a jug, and they are subject to the laws of exploitation, as they remain movable property? Or perhaps once he plants them in the soil, they've now become subordinated to the ground, and now they're being treated under the laws of land. And the Gemara asks, well, what are the circumstances? If we say that the hired laborer said, I sowed 6 kav of grain in the field, and witnesses came and said that he sowed only 5 kav in the field, but doesn't Rava himself say, with regard to any item that is otherwise subject to the laws of exploitation, and it is sold by measure or by weight or by number, even if the disparity was less than the measure of exploitation in the transaction is reversed, meaning a disparity of 1/6 between the value of an item and its price constitutes exploitation only in cases where there is room for error in assessing the value of an item. But in a case where the sale item is easily quantifiable, any deviation from the designated quantity results in nullification of the transaction, even if the wheat kernels are subordinate to the ground. In other words, if I say I'll pay you $100 for 10 books, right, and you give me 9 books, well, then you gave me less than what I paid for, and even though the difference is less than 1/6, I can still nullify this transaction because you did not deliver what we agreed on. And that would be the case even if, we weren't talking about books, we were talking about plants, and the plants got planted in the ground. The law doesn't change to there's no exploitation when we're talking about land, because what we were talking about is plants, right? And the fact that the plants went into the ground doesn't change their status from plants to land. So rather, it is a case where the hired laborer said, I cast kernels in the field as required, without quantifying the measure of the kernels that he cast, and it was discovered that he did not cast the kernels in the field as required. Are they subject to the laws of exploitation, or are they not subject to the laws of exploitation? Is the legal status of these wheat kernels like that of kernels cast into a jug, and they are subject to the laws of exploitation, or perhaps the laborer subordinated these wheat kernels to the ground when he planted them? Rava raises an additional dilemma. If the laborer admitted to part of the claim, right? Partial admission means that now he swears but for the part of the claim that he admits that he played, that he admits that he admits that he owes partially, which means he's claiming that he paid part of it and that the rest he was never really owing. In that case, he can swear an oath because he has admitted to part of the claim. That's admitted. And as for the part that he claims he doesn't owe, he can swear an oath and then he goes free. The claim, that claim is not going to work against him because this is all done in the absence of witnesses. So if the laborer admitted to part of the claim, does he take an oath with regard to the kernels, or does he not take an oath with regard to the kernels? Because taking oaths, right, we don't do that about land, we do that about movable property. Is there a legal status like that of kernels cast into a jug, and one takes an oath with regard to them in a case of partial admission? Or perhaps he subordinated them to the ground, and one does not take an oath with regard to them, as the law is that one does not take an oath about a claim involving land. So Rava raises yet another dilemma. Does the sacrifice of the Omer, right? We are now counting the Omer, right? The days that we count from the second day of Passover to Shavuos, 50 days. This is the period right now where we're counting the Omer. Does the sacrifice of the Omer offering permit one to eat the produce grown from these kernels, or does the sacrifice of the Omer offering not permit one to eat the produce? And the Gemara asks, what are the circumstances? If it is a case where the kernels took root, we already learned the law. If it is a case where the kernels did not yet take root, we already learned that law also. As we learned in the Mishna, if crops took root before the sacrifice of the Omer offering renders it permitted to eat them. And if not, if they took root only after the sacrifice of the Omer offering, it is prohibited to eat them until the time for the sacrifice of the next Omer offering will arrive. So no, Rava's dilemma is not superfluous, as it is necessary, and I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. It is not superfluous, as it is necessary to raise it in a case where one reaped grain and sowed its kernels prior to the time of the Omer offering, and the time of the Omer offering arrived and passed while they were in the ground, and the kernels did not take root before the sacrifice of the Omer offering. So this is Rava's dilemma. What is the law? Is it permitted for one to take some of the kernels and eat from them? Is their legal status like that of kernels cast into a jug, and the sacrifice of the Omer offering rendered their consumption permitted? Or perhaps he subordinated them to the ground, and their legal status is that of seeds that did not take root, and they are therefore forbidden. And the Gemara concludes that all these dilemmas shall stand unresolved. Take coup. Okay. I am scanning comments because Nina is busy getting ready for festival meals tonight and tomorrow night and Tuesday. Okay, so what am I seeing here? Joe says, when tithing, are people to set aside only their finest for priests, Levites, and or the temple, or may they give, say, the first percentages of what is produced, referred to as a straight run in harvesting produce, or say the first 5 chicks hatched? So I think what it sounds like, if you just did the straight run, you might end up tithing from inferior quality produce, at least with respect to the rest of it, which made it, there might have been much better produce that came along later. So you run that risk. And so I think what we learned is that lechatzila, right, ab initio, you should take from the best produce for the tithe. But if you didn't do that, then you have fulfilled your obligation. And Bill, speaking as someone who is a perennial tenant, it seems to me that common sense would make rentals of real property subject to the law of exploitation, or otherwise governed by the Torah to prevent excessive rents. I will concede that there might be a way for a tenant to exploit a landlord on paper, but I have a hard time conjuring a realistic situation that might arise. I mean, I guess what that would be is where there's a glut, right? I mean, there are areas of the country that during COVID, everyone left downtown areas and landlords just couldn't, get rid of the spots. And so the prices came way down. Maybe a landlord was desperate and some tenant said, well, I'll sign a lease if you give me this market price that's here now on a 10-year lease, and the desperate landlord took advantage of it, and then maybe that would be unwound. But the question we ask today is, is rental land or real property going to be considered like land in the sense that these laws of exploitation don't apply the way they would for movable property? Now, you might certainly ask, why? Why is it that land is not, in the laws of exploitation? I guess part of the reason is because even though you can say that there are comps, right? Like neighboring houses are going to be, they're going to be subject to very similar pricing. Nonetheless, every piece of land and even every apartment unit in an apartment building is a unique place. And, for lots of other reasons that just involve the interpretation of verses in the Torah, where the sages came out, is that exploitation doesn't apply. Now, exploitation doesn't apply, but fraud certainly does, right? When you're talking about, because our Mishna also talked about stealing land, right? And penalties that apply after that penalties that apply after stealing don't apply in the cases of these items, right? Slaves, documents, land, and consecrated property. So what would it mean to steal land? I mean, one thing is you could say the absentee owner, and somebody comes along and says, well, that guy's, who knows when he's coming back. I'll pretend I own this, and I'll commit fraud and sell it to someone else. So that might be a form of stealing land. But there's actually another form of stealing land, which is what I was alluding to in the title of today's show, The Good Fences Make Good Neighbors. People recognize it's a line from a Robert Frost poem. I believe it's called Mending Fences. But one form of stealing land is a person who moves the property marker, right? That would be very sly. And when his neighbor wasn't looking, he moves the property marker. And so, he enlarges his plot at the expense of his neighbor. And that is stealing. That's just outright stealing. But the penalty for that is you have to move it back, and maybe there'll be, and his reputation will suffer, etc. But it's not that we're going to move it back and then move it even further, and sort of give part of his land to the neighbor, and sort of commit the same action on him that he tried to pull on his neighbor. We actually don't do that. And perhaps that's because, all fields have ancestral heritage in the land of Israel. And this is all in the context of the distribution of land as it was done by Joshua at the time that the Jewish people came out of Egypt and entered our ancestral homeland 3,300 years ago. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again on Wednesday. Everyone who's celebrating Passover, may you have a beautiful, uplifting, energizing, and spiritually energizing final days of Passover. Tonight begins 7th and 8th day Passover, full-fledged holidays. And may they be, joyful and meaningful. All the best, my holy sisters and brothers, and look forward to seeing you again at the regular time on Wednesday, 6 p.m.